Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. There are moments in our lives when the weight of judgment hangs heavy in the air, moments when people are assessed not by their abilities, but by the assumptions drawn from their faces, their backgrounds, or the unfamiliar paths that led them to where they stand. Today, I want to tell you about one such moment, a moment that began with laughter but ended with a salute that echoed far beyond the walls of a medical ward. It is a moment that reminds us why humility matters, why respect must be our default, and why we should never underestimate the quiet strength that walks beside us. When she first stepped into the military hospital, the new nurse carried herself with the reserved determination of someone who had already endured much more than anyone could see. Her uniform was crisp, but her shoulders bore an invisible history. The doctors, seasoned and overworked, glanced up at her with skepticism. She was younger than they expected, slighter than they preferred, and her eyes, calm but piercing, seemed to unsettle some of them. To a few, she looked out of place, almost too gentle for a ward filled with wounded soldiers and the constant echo of urgency. And so the chuckles began. Quiet at first, then louder in the break room, where people often forget their professionalism. They laughed at her sighs. They laughed at her silence. They laughed because they mistook stillness for weakness. They laughed because the easy thing to do is judge, and the hardest thing is wait long enough to discover what a person is truly made of. Days passed, and the hospital saw a rising influx of injured soldiers. The air often shook with the weight of helicopters landing and boots rushing down the corridor. One afternoon, a captain was rushed in, gravely wounded, barely conscious, his uniform torn, his breathing shallow. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The doctors barked orders, instruments were prepared, and the ward snapped into motion. The new nurse stepped forward without hesitation. But this time, no one laughed. They watched, curious to see if she could keep pace. As the captain's condition worsened, panic began to creep into the room. A critical piece of equipment malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. The doctors scrambled to fix it, the tension rising with every passing second. And then, quietly, almost invisibly, the new nurse moved. She didn't speak. She didn't hesitate. With swift precision, she performed a manual intervention, one that required not just skill, but steady nerves and absolute focus. It bought them the time they needed. It stabilized the captain long enough for the doctors to regain their footing and complete the procedure. The room fell silent, but this silence was different from the cold one that greeted her arrival. This silence was filled with realization. They had misjudged her. When the operation ended, hours later, she was the last to leave the room. Not out of exhaustion, but because she stayed to check and double-check every line, every monitor, every detail. Care, after all, is not just a duty, it is an expression of character. The next morning, as the sun rose through the blinds and the ward settled into a soft hum, the wounded captain awoke. His voice was weak, but his gratitude was unmistakable. The doctors gathered around, recounting the events to him, giving credit where it was due. The captain looked around the room, searching for the nurse they spoke of. When she stepped forward, unsure of what to expect, he struggled upright, despite his pain, despite the trembling in his limbs, and he saluted her. A captain saluting a nurse. The doctors stood stunned, not because of the salute itself, but because of the symbolism behind it. In that single gesture, he acknowledged her courage, her competence, and her compassion. He acknowledged what they had failed to see at first glance. That salute was not simply an expression of gratitude, it was a correction. A reminder. A lesson. The laughter stopped that day. Replaced by respect, by introspection, and perhaps a little shame. But more importantly, replaced by growth. Because, you see, the true strength of a person does not shout, it reveals itself in the quiet moments when action speaks louder than pride. This nurse didn't demand recognition. She didn't defend herself against their doubts. She simply did her work, with steadiness, with integrity, and with a calm confidence that came from knowing who she was. And the doctors learned something invaluable, that every person who walks through our doors carries a story we have not read, a history we do not know, and capabilities we might never imagine. That judgment clouds our vision, while humility sharpens it. That respect should not be earned by extraordinary acts but given freely from the beginning, because extraordinary potential lives in all of us. In our workplaces, our communities, and even in our families, how many times do we repeat the same mistake? How often do we judge too quickly, assume too easily, dismiss too casually? How often do we overlook the quiet ones, the new ones, the ones who don't match the picture in our minds? Too often, we forget that courage does not always roar. Compassion does not always announce itself. Competence does not need applause to exist. The wounded captain's salute was more than a gesture. It was a reminder that roles and ranks may define our responsibilities, but they do not define our worth. Respect flows not from title, but from action. And dignity belongs to all of us. So let us carry forward the lesson born in that hospital ward. Let us look at one another with open eyes and open minds. Let us choose respect over ridicule, curiosity over assumption, and empathy over arrogance.